We will be talking, of course, today about the absolute OG of political theory, the man himself, the boogeyman of people all the way from the Tory party to Elon Musk. We will be talking about Karl Marx and the theory that is based on his writings, which is Marxism. So I hope I'll do a good job summarizing this. And then, of course, tomorrow, wait, today's Thursday? Yes. Tomorrow we'll talk about critical theory. Both of these theoretical strands are closely linked. Critical theory, though, arguably builds on top of Marxism, so it makes sense that we first talk about Marxism before we talk about theories that are built on some of the insights that are coming from Marxism. And if you want to sum up the worldview of Marxism really in one simple sentence, it would be that the world isn't quite right. This isn't okay, the world we live in, but the system is also rigged against us once we've made this insight. And once we want to do something about it, that gets quite hard because, well, the system doesn't want to be changed, okay? It's rigged against us. If you ever felt like, you know, this system that I currently live in, that's not really working for me, right? Like, I'm not going to buy a house. Politics isn't going to listen to me. You know, things are probably going to stay the same, and that means it's worse for me than it was for my parents or my grandparents. Then you are familiar with this type of feeling, right? That the system kind of isn't really working for you, and that you probably also aren't expecting that it will work for you in the future. So let's start from the observation of inequality, though. Let's say that you are on the one side, right? This is when you search on stock photos for clueless student or confused student, I think. You get this guy. I've been using him for years. I feel like I know him at this point. So imagine you on the one side of a hypothetical scenario that I'm going to spin in a second, and then imagine general cool guy and also billionaire haver Elon Musk on the other side, right? By the way, the same Elon Musk that complained that his daughter was turned by people that taught communism in schools. So he probably wouldn't like my lecture today, but I'm okay with that. I'm sure he's also okay with me teaching this today. So let's say you on the one side and Elon Musk on the other side. Now, imagine you make a decision like you make them every day dozens of times potentially, right? Imagine you have 500 pounds in the bank. That is the money that you can do something with. I know no one has 500 pounds in the bank, but still, let's just imagine for a second, okay, that you can freely do with 500 pounds whatever you want, and you are making a decision about 1 pound, a purchase decision about 1 pound, right? That 1 pound out of the 500 pounds that you have represents about 0.2% of your money. And that is, in other words, the Snickers decision, okay? So if you go out and you decide whether or not you buy a Snickers, think of how long you normally think about these types of decisions. How long does it take you to arrive at making that decision? Probably not terribly long. So you make a decision about 1 pound. When you have 500 pounds, that means buying a Snickers. Now you can probably already see where this is going, because if Elon Musk makes a similar decision on a similar Thursday afternoon, he actually has, I have to update the stat constantly. Like, I don't know if he's at the moment worth 220 billion. Someone fact check me if you want to, but at the time when I made these slides, he had 220 billion pounds in the bank, right? He could do something with 220 billion. So that means when he makes a Snickers decision, that means he makes a decision about 440 million pounds, because that also constitutes 0.2% of his net assets. And that is the equivalent of actually not 1 Airbus A320, but 4 Airbus A320. So you go out and you buy 4 Airbus planes, and then you actually still have enough money left over to buy a 40 million pound house somewhere in the countryside. Okay? So that is the equivalent scope of a decision made between you and Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. Okay? So it's pretty clear that this, I would argue, is not okay, right? When you make a decision about a Snickers, Elon Musk can go around and throw out planes, right? And he can do this every day without losing anything, right? It doesn't have to care, right? Money is meaningless to a person with this much, right? It ceases to be an effect on your life, right? It's just a thing, right? But you don't have to worry about it. And clearly this type of inequality, I would argue, as a Marxist, I'm not, but I have to be for today, as a Marxist, this inequality is unacceptable, okay? And if you think like, oh, why are you using the richest man in the world? You know, there's plenty of other rich people, and maybe, you know, there's always the story that rich people tend to work really hard for their fortunes. As the Twitter account on the left points out, if you started making $5,000 a day ever since the time that Columbus sailed to the Americas, you would still not be a billionaire today, okay? So whatever you think a good salary is, it's not enough to become a billionaire just from a salary, right? It's clear that your money has to come from elsewhere. There has to be other sources for you to generate wealth. And then the person on the right points out that this is actually not a bug, but this is a feature of the system. So this type of inequality maybe isn't just happening, it's also accepted that that's happening, and maybe some people even think that's okay that this is happening, right? Now, where does Marxism come from? So who was the first person that now packaged this insight about this gross inequality, this inequality that is unfair and morally dubious, right? It's unethical to have this much inequality in the world. And by the way, I didn't even mention this. You guys with 500 pounds in the bank buying a Snickers, you're actually rich compared to the majority of the world, right? The majority of the world doesn't have 500 pounds lying around, and they have to live off, potentially, the entire money that you spend on a Snickers to nourish themselves or even a family, right? So you're not even the bottom end of the spectrum. And once you open this giant pair of scissors in terms of inequality, you see how dramatic this gets. So inequality is where we start. Now, Karl Marx says, Karl Marx, born in Trier, so my countryman, he grew up in the early 19th century, and if you know anything about the 19th century, you know it was very turbulent. It was an age of not only industrial revolution, but also actual political revolutions and political upheaval. He was radicalized in these. So, for example, the revolutions of 1848 was a wave of revolutions that was sweeping through Europe, and he got caught up in that. So for anyone that was politically radicalized against the authorities, it wasn't a good idea to stay in Germany at the time. So he saw the signs and he left for Paris, where he more or less met Engels, Friedrich Engels here at the bottom, at a cafe. And the sources tell us that Karl Marx was more of a heavy, depressed drinker, and Friedrich Engels was a Teutonic, happy drinker. So in other words, they struck some kind of relationship, and of course it is through the writings of both Marx and Engels at the same time that we now have this theory that we call Marxism. But more accurately, we should probably call this Marxism-Engelism. For a whole 20 years, he wrote his magnum opus, which was Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, or The Capital, a critique of political economy. And that was basically his big idea about how this whole economy, political economy, and world history and everything was supposed to work. That was such a big idea that they needed several volumes, and he had the good idea of dying before more than the first couple of volumes were published. So that also means that Friedrich Engels, his collaborator, actually finished this series of books that described this whole theory. Now, Friedrich Engels himself had an interesting background, maybe one you aren't expecting from a Marxist. He was also born in Germany, and his family was quite rich, and they had a bunch of textile factories in England. And when he went there for an internship, more or less, with the idea of maybe taking over the family factory, he saw how poorly the workers were treated there and how little they garnered an income and how generally bad the living conditions were. And that shook him so much that he published a book in 1845 called Lage der arbeitenden Klasse in England, the situation of the working class in England. And that was basically just a description about, like, shit's really bad there, people. And that made him not only go away from taking over the family textile factory, but also dedicate the rest of his life to think about these types of inequalities together with Marx. And he's also the editor of the second and third volumes of Das Kapital. So this kind of meeting of the minds, right, these two thinkers that both were deeply interested and affected by also inequality and trying to come up with a big theory that explained how we got here, but also how we can get out of this situation of inequality. So Marxism, to put it relatively simply, is a theory that analyzes historical patterns. And these historical patterns are about mostly the material and economic development of societies. So Marxism is at its core maybe almost more an economic theory than just a political theory. Or, I mean, you can call it a political theory of political economy, right? That's probably the accurate description. But rather than just stop and say, well, this is how the world currently works, Marx went a step further and he defined that there should be an emancipatory goal of this kind of theorizing. You can't just say, well, the world is really screwed up and then leave it there basically and go home and collect the royalties from your book. No, you have to actually say, how can that be changed? And what are pathways to changing this, right? Can this be changed? Can this world be made less unequal and less unfair? So a normative critique of capitalism. Capitalism at the time he considered to be the dominant form in which societies were economically organized and the dominant form in which products were produced. And he says, well, capitalism is the problem, right? Currently the world works under capitalism, and this is bad because capitalism as a system is fundamentally built on exploitation. You cannot have capitalism without exploitation of the working class. There is no gentle capitalism, there's no nice capitalism, there's no nice capitalists. The system itself is set up so that people are exploited. That's how it works, and anyone that supports capitalism accepts this, basically. And the people that are exploited are the working class, all of us, maybe, and the people that are doing the exploiting are the bourgeoisie. So you could also call them the upper class, the elites, the capitalists, maybe the political class, whatever you want to call it. Right? And the aim of Marxism is, of course, to transcend this current state of how societies are organized. It is to say, well, capitalism, that's not good enough. That's not the best idea we've ever come up with. We need to find something beyond capitalism. And that is what a communist society would be, which is a society in which things are produced without exploitation, largely because the workers themselves own the means of production. Imagine you yourself owning the factory you work at. That's nice. So like a cooperative model of production, basically. And that would eventually not only mean that private property would go away, but also that class would disappear as a feature. So people no longer belong to separate classes, but we will all be in a classless society, and eventually we wouldn't even need a state anymore, because a state, after all, is a corrective, right? The state corrects things that aren't going right in society, but in a communist society that's no longer the case. And with the elimination of private property, also many of the problems we see in society today go away. So Marxism says, here's historical patterns. We've gone through a couple of different stages of how societies evolve. Now we're in capitalism, and capitalism is bad because it's built on exploitation, so that means we have to reach something beyond it, and that is a communist society. Now, what does he mean when he says capitalism is fundamentally built on exploitation? This is going to be extremely simplified, so don't imagine that I'm going to give you the entirety of like Capital 1, 2, 3 on this little schematic. But imagine all of us were workers, right? We sell our labor, essentially we sell the time and the effort that we spend to make things, right? And imagine, by the way, this is an economy, this is a 19th century economy he's describing, right? You don't make money by going to a call center or like working as an influencer or something. You make money by going to a factory and investing actual physical labor and making something, okay? That's how things are produced. So we sell our labor and of course also our skills, because not all labor is just stupid sort of manual labor. Some labor is quite skilled. But anyway, we have to sell our labor to make a living. Who do we selling this labor to, though? Well, we're selling it to the capitalist, effectively. Because while in the olden days, imagine a medieval town, right? The smith had everything and owned everything that he needed to make the things he had to, right? To make a horseshoe, for example, you have your own forge and you have your hammers, your tools. You make that and you sell that good. But in the modern world, that's no longer the case. Right? The modern world, the economy of the modern world, including the 19th century world, has gotten so complex that normally an individual worker can't really produce a very complex good. You can't go out there and like artisanally make a car or something. I mean, I make this joke always, but like I'm sure there's some hipsters in Brooklyn that are like making cars and it takes like 11 years to make one or something, and it's amazing, but no one can wait for it. But for most of the products of the modern world, you are aware that it's not one person making it one at a time, right? It's you going to a factory because you need an infrastructure around it. But you as a worker don't own that infrastructure. The infrastructure is owned by someone called a capitalist. And the infrastructure, sort of the work environment that you have, your tools, all the other things, that's together called the means of production. And in a sense, because you have to sell your labor to the capitalist to earn money to buy food and things, you are kind of also owned by the capitalist in a sense, right? So the capitalist not only owns the means of production, i.e. the factory, but he also kind of owns you, because otherwise where would you get money from? Now, where does the exploitation come in though? Now, imagine that who generates the value of a good, okay? If you just start with the raw materials, a raw material, a bunch of aluminium and steel and whatever doesn't make a car. The person that actually instills those things with a value is the worker. So you instill value in a thing by working on it. You put things together, you forge things, you like move things from A to B, you skillfully put things together. Like, you are the one that generates the value of the good. And that means that you generate a surplus. What does that mean? It means that if the raw materials of a car are worth £1,000, I know that's not what they're worth, but still, if the raw materials of a car are worth £1,000, of course the car factory doesn't sell that car for £1,000 to someone, to some private individual, right? They will sell it for £20,000. And that means that the car, through your labor, those materials have become £19,000 worth more. Okay, that's the surplus that you generate. And now you could say, well, great, okay, the worker generates the surplus, so surely the worker should get that surplus, because otherwise, what have you invested your time for? What have you worked for if you don't get that surplus? But, says Marx, the surplus actually in a capitalist system goes to the capitalist. It doesn't go to the worker, right? When you make one car, you don't get the additional, the full price of the car as your wage. You get a fixed wage, and oftentimes that wage is in no way related to the value of the object, right? You make relatively little while the object can be worth a lot. And that surplus up top, that is being taken away by the capitalist. It's not given back to you. You made the car £19,000 worth more, but you're not getting £19,000 in salary. You're only getting, say, £4,000. And then where does the rest of the money go to? Well, it goes to the capitalist, the person owning the means of production. So because you generate all the value, the capitalist isn't standing there like at the assembly line making the car, right? He's sitting up top, you know, looking out of his factory and lets you do the jobs, lets you do the work. So because you that does the work that makes the object worth more doesn't actually get that added value as a salary, that means it's inherently exploitative. And of course, the capitalist has to skim some off the top. The capitalist has to take away the surplus because the capitalist doesn't work. A factory by itself doesn't generate anything, right? It's just a hunk of metal that's sitting there. They need to get a salary. They need to get money too, so they need to take it away from you. The capitalist can only make money if they take it away from you as the worker. They cannot pay you fairly, because if they paid you fairly, they would pay you as much as the good is worth afterwards. But if they did that, there would be zero left for them. And that is why capitalism is inherently an exploitative system. Okay, you can't have capitalists, you can't have people not working without starving, basically, without them exploiting you. That's the core idea of how Marx sees the capitalist system. Okay? Now, the problem with this is that you don't have to be terribly smart to understand this. If you are a worker in a car factory, you understand that, you know, when you assemble 1,000 cars a month, or you partake in that, you're not getting the value of 1,000 cars a month in salary, right? It's pretty easy to see that you're not getting paid as much as you could be paid. And so that means that Marx says, well, to stabilize this relationship, to stabilize the relationship of exploitation, you need institutions. You need a structure around it that does its own job to stabilize the system and basically keep you quiet, in a sense. So when Marxists think about the state, they very rarely see the state as a solution to anything. Because in a system that is built on inequality, the institutions of the state legitimize that inequality. They basically tell you, like, this is how the system is set up. There's plenty of ways for you to protest, for example. There's plenty of ways for you to make your voice heard, right? You can join a union, or you can, like, vote for labor, or whatever, right? There's so many ways that you can address if you think this world is unequal. But of course, Marxists say that's all bullshit, because the state's institutions have no interest in helping you out of your current situation. They have no interest in helping the working class. They have been set up to stabilize this exploitative relationship, okay? So the state is nothing more than an expression of the modes of production. The modes of production are unequal. You have a party that is the capitalists, you have a party that's the working class, and the state is set up to mirror this. So the state is always a product of class struggle. So this is the product of this. So the state as we see it today is the product of the capitalists subjugating the working class. You see this very nicely illustrated. You often see this when capitalism is talked about. This is an illustration from the early 20th century, I think from 1913 or something, that illustrates this Marxist view of how a state works, right? The working class is all the way at the bottom. They are the downtrodden. They are the ones that do all the work. We work for all and we feed all, they say at the bottom. And then everyone that's sitting on top of this is just exploiting them in a variety of ways, right? The bourgeoisie on top, we eat for you, as if, of course, the working class needs help with that. On top of that is the military that shoots at you, the religion and the clergy that lies to you and fools you, and all the way at the top, the monarchs and the politicians that rule you. And of course, at the very top, you have the idea of capitalism itself, right? That's the idea of, this is how Marxists see the state. The state's not your helper. The state's not your friend. The state's not going to fix your problems because it's built on perpetuating a capitalist system. Now, Marxism is often described as being based in two different things, in historical materialism and in dialectical materialism. So you will read this in many bits of literature, and so I just wanted to, by the way, did I just lose my mic? No, I did. I just wanted to clarify these two things because they often appear. So historical materialism basically means that that history is based on, you can have a reading of history that is based on the distribution of materials, okay? So who has a lot and who doesn't have a lot. That oftentimes tells you a lot about the situations at a given time. You can, of course, analyze other things, but fundamentally deep down, when you have a good grasp of who the haves and the have-nots are, how the material capabilities are distributed, then you normally also understand what's going on and who's exploiting whom and who's on top and who's at the bottom. And the idea, of course, is that you can only ever overcome a specific configuration of this through class struggle. This is going to be violent. This is not going to be easy. This is not going to be nice, because the capitalists have no interest in simply letting the working class rise. They want to keep the working class down. So historical materialism means you look at the material conditions of the time, largely to understand specific eras of history. And dialectical materialism basically means that things are always context dependent, okay? So we produce history in our actions, but history also produces us. That's the dialectical thing, right? It's like a conversation, basically. It's sometimes shown by this thing on the right here that you might have seen in other contexts, where we say there is a base in any society. This is kind of how material things are distributed, right? So how production is organized and how the means of production are organized. And then you have a superstructure on top of that that is everything that's not directly related to production. So things like media, religion, politics, the non-tangible stuff, if you will, right? And the idea of dialectical materialism is that these two things are kind of mutually constituted in a sense, right? We are a product of our current times, and then we sort of make the next times, in a sense. We might be limited by the base, right? We can't just decide whatever. We're just going to make a new society, basically. We're limited, in a sense, but we can still act. And then whoever comes next is a product of that time, and will try to change the following time for them. So that's dialectical materialism. But a Marxist would certainly say that the stuff at the bottom is arguably more important or often neglected in favor of just looking at the stuff at the top. A Marxist would be disgusted with us even calling this political science. How can you call it political science if you just start with taking the political system as a given, right? Why are you not looking at the underlying systems of production and inequalities and things, right? Why do you're starting too high? You can't understand politics if you don't understand the base underneath it, is what a Marxist would say. So it's the idea that the world around us matters. The material world around us matters, and we can't pretend that it doesn't. Now, I've already told you, of course, about what Marx thinks about capitalism. He thinks generally it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea for a variety of reasons. And he thinks that modern history, so this is the history, roughly speaking, maybe from, say, the Industrial Revolution, probably a little bit before that, right? But we didn't really have a large-scale proletariat, a large-scale working class before that, because production was still fairly small scale. And he says, well, modern history was shaped by capitalism, but this isn't a story, this isn't a feel-good story. This isn't a story where things get better over time. This is actually a tragedy. The fact that we live in a capitalist society, because we have not only exploitation, but also alienation. Alienation is a really important thing, a really important concept in Marxist thinking. I'm not going to talk about that all that much, but Suffice it to say, if you've ever seen that Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, you probably haven't because you're not 100 years old, but anyway, it's a movie where he works on a conveyor belt in a factory, and he basically does this all day long until he can't do anything but this, and he like walks around and just moves his arms in the same fashion. That is because as a worker in an industrial society, you no longer have anything to do with the product. You just do you put like the same fucking button on the car like 500 times a day, and then you go home, and then you come back and you put the next button on the car. Like, what is your relationship to the thing you're making, right? So you get alienated from your own products. You also get alienated from other workers, because I'm a button man, why would I talk to a lever man, right? So there's a feeling that in a capitalist society, you are alienated from many things around you. That's, again, a symptom of the world not being quite right. And communism, of course, would be a disalienation. It would bring back that relationship between you and the product, right, in a communist society. And I've already said, right, capitalism must exploit its workers. It can't work any other way. And eventually, this unresolved tension, this system of exploitation, will lead to one class rising up against the other. So eventually, there will be a revolution where the working class says, we can't take this any longer. We overthrow the capitalists and the bourgeoisie, right? And now Marx was thinking very hard about when that would happen and where that would happen. Yes? What? Just now. So there we go. Yay, let's overthrow the system of exploitation. Thank you for that info. I've never had that happen live in a lecture. So that's fantastic. So let's think then for the next 20 minutes about, maybe what we can do about the inherent system of exploitation. Because, of course, what would a Marxist do after having received this news? A Marxist would go, right? A Marxist would go, meh, this doesn't matter. Because the next person coming into power will just perpetuate the same system, right? Yeah, we might not like Liz Truss, or she might be incompetent, or whatever we think about her, right? But do we think that the next Tory is going to change things for the better for us? Do we think the next Labour Prime Minister is suddenly going to make this into a fair and equal society? No, right? A Marxist would be deeply depressed about this news, because if anything, it just shows the general dysfunction of the political system, okay? Marxism is a great spoilsport theory, okay? You can make anything into not cool news when you hear it, but thank you for that. Now, you might have waited because we only have 20 minutes to go. Where the hell does the IR theory come in? I've told you many things about like people going to factories and building cars and blah, blah. Where does the IR side come in? Well, the IR side comes in whenever we extend the idea of capitalism to the global level, effectively. And I have this on the next slide too, but we need to remember that Marx didn't want to create an IR theory. He's not a Mearsheimer, he's not a Cohen. He didn't set out to describe how the world works. He set out to describe how the political economy of a state worked, or of states on the domestic level. So Marxists would say, well, capitalism relates to IR in a variety of different ways, right? We can first say, if the global system generally is capitalist, then the world would be inherently unequal. So it's unequal because it's capitalist. This is also by design. Same way that the nation-states institutions are designed to prop up the capitalist system, same way the international institutions will also prop up a capitalist international system. The system will not fix itself, just like on the state level. It's pointless to expect that the next person in power will change anything because they just work for the capitalists. They're bought out, or they have a personal interest in not doing that. And because we live in a country in which the Chancellor of the Exchequer once was an actual billionaire, you might see why this might have some merit, this idea. And conflicts, of course, if we think that predicting conflicts is one of the core jobs of IR theory, then we could say, well, conflicts will arise where actors rebel against this globally unequal system. And largely, we will probably see these conflicts to arise along class lines. So the same classes in several countries might rise up, for example, and start a revolution, which then might lead in the domino effect to the falling of more states. So conflict will arise from economic conditions, right? Will not be really driven by strategic concerns or other things, but from economic conditions and equality. But as I said, Marx didn't set out to create an IR theory, so we actually have to look at people after Marx to come up with proper things that we might consider IR theory. I mean, he acknowledged that there was an international dimension, but he didn't think it mattered very much. He didn't say very much about colonialism or imperialism. That wasn't his main focus. So Marxist scholars look at all the things we tend to look at in IR, international cooperation, international institutions, conflicts, and in all of these, they will look for relationships of power and domination and exploitation. So the way that the system is set up, if it is capitalist, it will be a system of domination and exploitation inherently. So what we want to figure out as we explain the international system is where these relationships are, who's on top and who's at the bottom, and do we think there's any chance of this changing anytime soon. So basically, by taking everything we've said about the domestic level, things are being produced, right? There's different classes working on different sides of the equation. There's capitalists on top, and there's class conflict. There's a struggle. We just take all of that and raise it to the international level, and hey presto, we have an IR theory, right? We just no longer talk about the working class of Germany or the working class of England. We talk about the global working class, for example, and the global capitalists. So that's how you get to an IR theory. So that also means that for Marxist scholars, the international system isn't actually characterized by anarchy. You know from the previous lectures on this course that anarchy is a key concept in many other IR theories. For example, liberal institutionalism is built on anarchy. Realism, of course, famously is built on the concept of anarchy. So the idea of the world being structured in a certain way and that certain way is unchangeable. Marxists don't think that. They think that the world has undergone a couple of different stages of evolution. We just now happen to be in a capitalist system, but there's nothing inevitable about it. This could change. This has already changed. So why wouldn't this change in the future? So the capitalist system of production is actually what characterizes the world and what can explain to us why certain things are happening in certain places. And so class structure, not the nation state, is our key unit of analysis. So states cease to be these like central actors here, and we should rather look at basically the global capitalists versus the global working class. And a lot of the more worked out theories of Marxism at the international level do this exact kind of thing. Now, the first thing, of course, that we need to mention is this is really nothing that needs to be debated, right? That we've created a transnational capitalist class nowadays. Again, general cool guy and billions haver Elon Musk on the right-hand side. So we know that the past sort of 100 years have created a global elite, an ultra-elite socioeconomic class, people that are basically for whom money plays no longer a role. I recently saw that there was a court filing that was released of Elon Musk's DMs when he was acquiring Twitter, because you know, of course, there's a court case going on. And if you find those online, right, Elon Musk DMs Twitter or something, and you will see that there's billionaires texting Elon Musk, and they're throwing out billion amounts like it's absolutely nothing. One guy texts him like, hey, can I get in on Twitter? And Elon's like, sure, I mean, how much? And he's like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 bill or so, right? No big deal. So this is how these people operate, right? So this is completely separate from the rest of the world here. So global production and financial systems integrate more and more of humanity. There's really no way for you, even if you build your fucking tiny house in Canada or something. I know we're all watching these YouTube videos. The tiny houses with the little gardens out back, okay, yeah, cool. But you're not really getting away from this capitalist financial system that rules the world nowadays. And because wealth, of course, as we all intuitively understand, buys you access and buys you political power. You can pal around with all kinds of people in politics if you just have enough money. That also means that you in this elite class tend to be insulated from wider societal challenges. And that erodes further the rights of workers and the ability of workers to rise up against the system, because you now suddenly have people globally that are suppressing you. They're not even in your same country. So how in the world are you going to rise up against these? I think personally the media should cover this a little bit more and not do things like GQ does, where they're like, hey, at this billionaires meeting, here's the fashion trends, okay? That's not really how we should analyze the world, of course, right? There's much more interesting things to say about the billionaire summer camp, and you can Google this, it's a real thing, about the billionaire summer camp than this. Now, 3 people really quickly that developed some semblance of an IR theory. You have Lenin at first, who took the basics of Marxism and built a work on it that was called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So he thought about what does capitalism do outside of the borders of its own country. He thought that capitalism was inherently expansive, so it was trying to expand and it was trying to export its brand of capitalism into new areas because it wanted the resources, it wanted the cheap labor, and eventually it just wanted to take over these other countries. So he thought that imperialism was a logical extension of capitalism. Countries going out there and building empires was a capitalist logic. And eventually he thought this would develop into a two-tiered structure where you have a developed core, so some countries where all the wealth goes, all the wealth is siphoned off towards this core, and you have a periphery that is much less developed and where people are just generally poor and they're selling their labor for barely enough to subsist. And he also thought that imperialism was a key source of World War I. If you look, of course, he wrote it in 1917, so World War I was just 3 years old and not over yet, and he was thinking about causes of this, and he thought imperialism was one of them. Two other thinkers refined this idea a little bit. On the left, you have Rosa Luxemburg, a German, who thought about a number of things to do with Marxism. She came up with something called under-consumptionist theory, where she pointed out what she felt was a flaw in capitalism, in that if you don't pay your workers that much, if you as a capitalist siphon off all the money, then who buys your products, basically? Your workers can't afford them, so is it just other capitalists and you just end up trading Lamborghinis back and forth, right? That's not how an economy could work. She also thought a lot about imperialism and the dependency of capitalist states on pre-capitalist states. So capitalist states needed exploitable pre-capitalist states elsewhere to keep themselves going. There was a hard limit on how much you can exploit your own working class. So the recipe for capitalism is you just go elsewhere where people are even poorer and you can exploit them even better. Unfortunately, she was killed by a militia in the turbulent times of the past First World War time in Berlin and thrown unceremoniously into the Spree. There's a nice memorial there if you ever go to Berlin, find it and pay your respects. You have Leon Trotsky on the other side that thought a lot about the developmental aspect of capitalist systems. So how does capitalism develop, especially in countries that aren't all that developed, right? And he pointed out that it was weird that you had at the same time countries that had a very advanced form of capitalism, but then also countries that didn't, like that were very underdeveloped in a capitalist sense. And he was puzzled by this, and that's the theory of uneven and combined development, that there could be an uneven level of capitalism around the world. And he also introduced the term of the permanent revolution and the international revolution into our dictionary. He was eventually killed in Mexico by an assassin with an ice pick through his ear. Throughout history, it hasn't been a good idea to be a Marxist thinker. So maybe there is something to that theory after all. It seems to worry certain people. Now, Wallerstein is one of the famous modern thinkers of Marxism, and he developed something that is actually not called a Marxist. I mean, he didn't call it a Marxist theory necessarily. He just called it the world systems theory. And again, his job was, as a good Marxist scholar, to understand how the international political economy worked and what impacts that might have on global politics. So he started with the idea that there is a low development of states in the world, but that development isn't just a stage on the path of progress. They're not going to naturally evolve into better and more prosperous societies. No, they are not only peripheral now, but they will stay peripheral because the more advanced states have no interest in them developing. This is what this looks like. Imagine you have countries in the core. These are highly developed countries. These are normally democracies. They have a big welfare state, so they pay their citizens quite well. They're highly industrialized and pay their workers high wages. So countries like Germany or the UK. And then you have the periphery, on the other hand. And these are the poorest countries in the world, right? Countries like the Gambia or Venezuela that tend to be non-democracies, that can't afford even having a welfare state, and where wages are often under the subsistence level, so where you're basically actively starving even though you give away all your labor. And these are barely industrialized. The problem now is, though, that if these two halves of the world would directly communicate and trade with each other, that would be pretty difficult, right? It would mean the core makes these high-value products, but they can't really sell them directly to the periphery because people there are too poor. In the same way, if you have the periphery directly interacting with the core, then you suddenly see that it's the absolute cheapest labor in the world that then has to make things for the richest people in the world. So Wallerstein says that's not really how it works. If it was just these two halves, the system would be too unequal, too unfair, and would collapse eventually. So what then keeps the system going? Because clearly the countries of the periphery, we don't think that they don't exist, right? This is definitely there, and they're definitely poor. Well, Wallerstein says there's an important bit in the world that is called the semi-periphery. And these are countries that are, for example, China, India, or Brazil, right? South Africa you could put in there. And these tend to be sort of hybrid regimes, right? They're democratized to a point, but they're not perfect, obviously. They have welfare states, but those might be quite weak. They generally have low wages, but not the lowest wages, and they have a medium level of industrialization. And so the way that the world system is set up now is, it's actually the periphery that trades its raw materials and its cheapest labor to the semi-periphery, who then make things with it and sell this on to the core, while the core sells high-profit goods back to the semi-periphery, and the semi-periphery sells, intermediate goods or cheap goods back to the periphery. So this is not a system of just two halves of the world, the haves and the have-nots, but it's the haves, the kind of haves, and the have-nots. And that is what he says keeps this system stable, right? The existence of a semi-periphery stabilizes this international economic system. This is just an attempt. I was desperately trying to find a good map that colors the world into these three kind of separate parts, but the last publication, the last good and well-cited publication is from over 20 years ago, so I have to try to color this in a little bit more. I would argue that the countries in blue here constitute the core. So the most highly capitalized societies. You have the countries in red, which are the periphery, which tend to be exploited, of course, in this international system. And then you have this semi-periphery that is fairly developed, but not entirely, and that themselves exploit the poorest, only to then be exploited by the richest. Okay? So basically, the semi-periphery is both exploited and exploiter towards the others. And that's what keeps this weird system in balance. So in other words, where Marx saw a conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, this is, I think, also I think that's in the data reading for today, this little graph, then Wallerstein here sees a three-tiered wedding cake, basically, with the periphery at the bottom, the core at the top, but in the middle there's kind of a buffer, right, that makes it so that the people in the core don't really have to worry all that much about what's going on in the periphery, because there's always a buffer in between. Now, I've been asked, obviously, to say a couple of words about what Marxism would say about the war in Ukraine, because I think the war in Ukraine, the current conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, is one of the things that several lectures in the course pick up. Is that correct? Yes? Have I prepared the completely wrong slides? Okay, good. Now, Marxists are having a bit of a hard time, and to do some research, because I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, I went out on the internet and I saw what were people saying on Marxist forums, in Marxist journals, and so on. So how were they debating the war in Ukraine? And it turns out it's pretty complicated. They don't agree on a lot. I mean, if you ever hung around with Marxists, you know that's like the base state of affairs, right? Like no one ever agrees. If you put 3 Marxists in a room, you get 4 opinions, obviously. But the war in Ukraine is especially complicated. So Marxists would say, if we want to understand this conflict better, let's go back to the 2 core concepts that we discussed that might structure the international world. And that, on the one hand, is capitalism. On the other hand, that's imperialism, right? So what role does capitalism play in this conflict, and what role does imperialism play in this conflict? Now, we should say that all the participants, so here our life is made a little bit easier, or maybe not, all the participants in this conflict are functionally capitalist. So all the NATO countries, of course, the West broadly supporting Ukraine, obviously those are all capitalist countries. Ukraine itself is also set up in a capitalist way. And Russia is also, at least de facto, a capitalist society, even though, of course, it is a capitalist society where this capitalism is especially extreme because it's distorted by an elite on the top that takes up really most of the profits, and almost nothing appears at the bottom, right? We all know about the oligarchs, for example, in Russia, that are able to siphon off immense amounts of wealth in a very short time by exploiting the other people in the system. So sometimes this has also been called oligarchic capitalism or political capitalism, because, of course, the interesting bit here is that the people running the country themselves aren't necessarily capitalists, or at least they are not painting themselves as capitalists. They are primarily political actors, even though they're unspeakably rich, of course. So if we want to look at why Russia is doing this, why Russia is invading Ukraine, then we should see whether or not we can say that Russian aggression is the product of the interests of the Russian ruling class. And here already it gets a little bit weird, right? Because we all have seen that oligarchs have actually been hit quite hard in the aftermath of this conflict, right? They have many sanctions placed upon them. Many people have had their big yachts taken away from them. Awesome. But it certainly doesn't seem like the ruling class of Russia is any richer now than they were before they started the conflict. And that's probably because they thought that the conflict was would be a lot shorter. Of course, famously, Russia seemed to believe that they could take over Ukraine in a matter of days by just taking Kiev and decapitating the regime basically there, and then the conflict would be over. And of course, if it was just this short conflict, yes, we could easily paint this as an easy way for Russia to exploit further resources, right? To have more people to draw from, to gain all the wealth that Ukraine has, and all these other things. So if the goal was a quick defeat and annexation of Ukraine eventually, then yes, we can probably paint this as a way in which the ruling class in Russia wanted to simply accumulate more wealth for themselves. Now, if we look at imperialism then, at the other side of the coin, we can probably pretty safely say that Russia is an imperialist power. So Russia has made no secret at all in the past, at least decade or so, of its plans to eventually kind of draw its neighbors ever closer, maybe even with the goal of eventually, reconstituting some sort of a Soviet Union, right? They've tried this certainly with Belarus and with a number of other neighboring countries too, and they've so far resisted to various degrees. Ukraine was the most vocal resistor, basically, of these plans. So we can certainly say that Ukraine is a war of conquest, right? It's not, let's not believe the tales of the Russian side that they were removing Nazis and other things, right? I think we all know what we have to think about these claims. Now, if we look at the other side of the conflict, Ukraine and its supporters, we can certainly say that Ukraine doesn't seem to have imperialist motives, right? Ukraine wasn't trying to expand its borders into Russia, but we can certainly say that the West isn't entirely standing there with a bright white shirt with no spots on it, right? The Western powers, at least seen from Russia, are also clearly imperialist. They are trying to expand their sphere of influence. They want to push NATO all the way up to the Russian border, and once you have Ukraine in NATO, then it's really over, because Ukraine is like 5,000 miles of just wide open field, and if anyone ever wanted to attack Russia, you could just roll your tanks right in there. There's nothing in the way. It's over, basically, right? Russia can't protect itself. At least this is the Russian perspective. So from the Russian side, this is also an imperialist move by NATO to come in here and take over Ukraine, if you will. So at least some Marxists have now painted this conflict as effectively an inter-imperialist war. So two imperialist powers, Russia on the one side and then NATO on the other side, clashing here and trying to figure out who has the better claim. The problem that Marxism has, I think, in this particular conflict here, is that nationalism plays a really large role on both sides, right? Russia tends to portray the conflict as a liberation of Russian people, a liberation of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, or the protection of ethnic Russians. And that's something that doesn't really work all that well with Marxism, because Marxists don't really see like nations and ethnicities as an important structuring factor of society. They think it should be mostly along class lines, right? So the working class in Russia should feel solidarity with the working class in Ukraine, and they should both work against the capitalist classes in both countries. The fact that suddenly the Russians are like beating their nationalist fists, and then on the other side the Ukrainians are also asserting their nationalist narrative of the conflict, right? That gives Marxism quite a lot of trouble. So the fact that this isn't happening, that there, for example, isn't a widespread uprising in Russia by the working class against this imperialist conflict, that's a problem for Marxists. So I think we can say Marxists would see capitalist imperialism as the war's main driver, right? They would see Russia as being driven by imperialist motives and by the desire to enrich further its capitalist class. And although both the combatants are capitalist states, and although Ukraine is arguably backed by powers that Marxists would see as imperialist, it's only Russia that's attempting an imperialist expansion, right? So it's only Russia that's trying to take away Ukraine's sovereignty and nationhood. It's not the other way around. So that also makes it clear who the aggressor here is and who's also in the wrong from a Marxist perspective. But as I said already, these narratives of nationalism obfuscate these dynamics sometimes and make it hard for Marxists to make that point strongly, and Marxists online at least are struggling a lot about what to feel because, of course, for the longest time they were probably much more supporters of Russia in any given international issue than they were with the Western powers. And of course we can also say that regardless of what happens in this conflict, whether Russia wins, the Ukraine wins, it ends in a stalemate or whatever, the working class is still going to get shafted, okay? Even if Ukraine wins this war decisively, liberates its people, kicks all the Russians out, it's still a capitalist system and people are still going to be exploited. So if anything, Marxists would demand an end to all imperialism. Russia out of Ukraine, but also NATO out of everything, right? That would probably be how a Marxist would approach this. All right, thanks very much for coming along with me on the ride. Tomorrow we'll do critical theory and I'll see you then at 10 a.m. bright and early.